Our speaker today is Gil Shapiro. He has a BA and a BA and a Doctor of Podiatric Medicine, or a foot doctor, in other words. He's been saving tired souls here in Arizona for over 30 years, and he's continuing to do that, and he's helping people here too in another soul-related activity. So he's published over 50 op-eds, many of which were for Free Thought Arizona. He's our silver tongue and silver writer. He does very well with both, writes well, speaks well, is very versed in the subject matter that he talks about. And so I think you're going to enjoy the talk today. He promotes rational and critical thinking, and he thinks that's the only really decent option for society. And I agree with that 100%, that this is really the way we have to go. If we can think clearly and act clearly, our life is going to be a whole lot better, and the world will be a lot better. So let's welcome Gil Shapiro.
So thank you so much for coming this morning. I think this is going to be a very interesting lecture for secularists in the group. Hopefully it will confirm what you've always thought. It might put a fine point on a lot of different subjects. For those who are believers in the group, this is going to be a very blunt lecture. I'm not going to pull any punches about the way secularism feels about certain issues. So it's almost like I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I'm going to be very straightforward in how we feel on certain issues. This is going to go about an hour. It may be a touch more because of working with two computers that we had not anticipated, but I think it's going to be worth it. I'm first going to divide the lecture into three different areas. And this may deal with subjects you weren't quite ready to hear about. I didn't want to deal with things that you can find in a book and all that. This is going to be a little bit of an interesting take on it, I think. The first part is going to deal with how believers and non-believers deal with premature death. That's death that's unexpected, it's tragic, it's before one's time. The second part will deal with how believers and non-believers deal with death that's natural, that kind of comes on time. And the third part is dealing with death and the afterlife, specifically the impossibility of there being a heaven, which is very provocative, but I hope to make the case. So Gloria Steinem's quote is very interesting. I'm going to deal with end-of-life issues from a secular perspective, with the uniquely human experience, perhaps the curse of being able to contemplate our own mortality, and of course the mortality of our friends and family and fellow human beings, and for that matter all living things in this world. We and everything that lives, or maybe fortunately or unfortunately, are mortal and subject to death. There are references, of course, that I've used and source material if you contact me at my email. Is this focused okay? Yeah. Sure? Okay. Oh, it's my glasses, that's on. Good catch there. Contact me, I'll be happy to provide that for you. While I have strong opinions, and I do not hold myself out as an expert in the field. If we were talking about bunion corrections and hammer toes and fungal nails, I'm board certified with that. But this subject matter, I've just, like you, have done a lot of reading and had a tremendous interest in this. My presentation is meant to inform, to challenge current thinking, to be provocative, and to prompt discussion. I'm going to use words like believer and theist and Christian interchangeably. I know the difference in meanings the same way we talk about secularist and non-believer an atheist. Talk of death and end-of-life issues have been traditionally subjects conceded to religion. But these are basic human issues that have every right to be discussed from a secular perspective, a position devoid of supernatural association or influence. Secularists, of course, manage mortality without asking guidance from or feeling subject to a deity. But with about 80% of Americans believing in a personal deity that controls everything, this atheistic attitude is in the minority. And secularists will certainly get pushback from those who regard this as their turf. Religionists have always been quick to voice opinions, no more like pronouncements, on matters such as abortion, end-of-life care, as in the Terry Schiavo fiasco some years ago, and on physician-assisted suicide, as in the case of Brittany Maynard, you know, that 29-year-old who had the brain tumor, to name just a few issues. And also, believers are sure there is an afterlife in heaven or hell. This sphere of influence is jealously guarded by believers, and it's not one that they're going to relinquish easily to non-believers. But I intend to explain how our understanding and management of mortality is not only different from theirs, but better. It's better because it's based on reason and experience and science, and not on conflicting and unsupportable religious dogmas and directives and claims. I'm going to talk about the differences between how believers and non-believers approach life and living, which affects their attitudes about dying and death. And like it or not, here are the cards all humans, and for that matter, all living things, are dealt. And sometimes I use the expression a profound grasp of the obvious, but it is. From the moment after conception, we age, and then we die. The question, of course, is how or when. Some die before the realization that they were even alive. I'm, of course, talking about embryos and fetuses and miscarriages and abortions. Some humans die after living longer than 115 years. And obviously, most of us are going to be somewhere between those two extremes. I guess the best we can hope for is extreme longevity, in good mental and physical health, and to be happy, or at least content, with our existence. This is a very interesting lady. Here's the story. In 1967, she was 92 years old, excuse me, 92 years old in 1967. She lived in the south of France. In France, they have a kind of a way of doing things. I guess we could do it here too, where a 47-year-old lawyer loved her home and said to this 92-year-old lady, "I'm going to pay you for your home, but the agreement is that I'll get it when you die." She didn't have any heirs or anyone she wanted to leave it with. She agreed to it. This was in 1967. She's 92. The lawyer's 47. Little did the lawyer know that he just signed a contract with the longest living human to have ever walked on this planet. This is Jeanne Calment, who lived in Arles, where Van Gogh was. She knew Van Gogh. She worked in her father's store, and he came in. She said he was dirty and scrappy and this and that. But she died in 1997 at the age of 122. The irony is that the lawyer died in 1996 at the age of 77, never having gotten her place. I mean, he figured when he signed the contract, how long do I have to wait? She's 92 years old. You never know. Death is normal. It's expected. It's not a failure. Death is not the enemy, but the natural order of things, except when it's not. When death is due to accident, violence, illness, natural disasters prior to old age, it is unexpected, it is shocking, it is tragic. How is premature death dealt with by believers and non-believers? Perhaps you saw this terrible photograph this week. This is a photo of a car that was crushed by a metal beam in the state of Washington, in Bonnie Lake. In that car were three innocent, God-fearing, church-going, they were even youth pastors, seemingly good human beings who were just driving along. Vanessa and Josh Ellis and their baby, 8-month-old Hudson. Notice how the beam hit the passenger compartment directly? If they had been driving just a little bit faster or just a little bit slower, they would not have been killed. Believers would admit that why God allowed this or even wanted this to happen is unclear. Fundamentalist Christians will even go so far as to say, listen, we all deserve death. We all do, because we're sinners. And we can never possibly live up to God's wishes. And the real question is, why does God let us live at all? This is sometimes, in many cases, the answer that fundamentalists use. To non-believers, if we accept for argument's sake that the God in question exists, which we don't, but if we do for argument's sake, the undeniable conclusion that at minimum, this God permitted this fatal event to happen, and if he permitted this event to happen, because he had the power to stop it through miracles, it was because he wanted it to happen. Sometimes the question gets to free will. Well, the driver had the free will to drive just at that speed. That's why that happened. I'll let you determine how viable that answer is. You're looking at the family there that was killed instantly. Vanessa, Josh, and little baby Hudson. They are no longer. This is the Sassoon children. It's not the greatest photo, but it captures these 7 children. They died in a fire in their second-floor bedrooms in Brooklyn, New York, a few weeks ago. You might have heard of that. The mother left a hot plate on downstairs, as is tradition in Orthodox Jewish homes, so that the ritual of not working on the Sabbath would be observed. And by not working, what I'm talking about is the flicking on of a switch. Not the actual use of electricity or the stove, it's the flicking on of the switch. The same way that religious people, they can't go into an elevator, not because they're prohibited from going up and down, they can't push the button. By working in this case, the hot plate malfunctioned, and in the ensuing fire, these children were burned to death. There were no smoke detectors. These people were following their God's strict instructions, and here's how they were rewarded. Was the mother exercising her free will by doing this? Or when you're very observant, do you really have free will? This concept of free will I'm going to bring up over and over in the talk, and it's going to be very important when I get to the heaven part later on, so bear with this. And by the way, this is not going to be an hour of these terrible things. I'm trying to make a point here. This is Andreas Lubitz, a pilot for Germanwings Airline, who decided to commit suicide and take his 138 passengers with him. Question, does God give free will to severely depressed and perhaps psychotic people? And if so, could an addled mind like his truly exercise free will? These are the Sunni and Shiites. Here are 2 groups who are extremely devoted to the same God. They have been killing each other nonstop for 1,400 years based on who succeeded the Prophet Muhammad after he died. Someone said it should be a cousin. The other one said it should be a close friend. And for that, they have been killing each other, and they are accelerating their killing of each other. So do enemies that do what these do base their actions on free will or scriptural directives? And shouldn't God somewhere over the centuries, like a good father, say, hey kids, stop fighting? And the tsunami. Now we're getting to natural events. Killed 250,000 people. The earth that God created is responsible here for the tornadoes, famines, hurricanes, and volcanoes. No issue of free will here, except for possibly that people decided to live in these places. This is the one in Japan in 2011. And of course, we have the Black Plague. In the 1400s, another natural event. Now, to believers, these tragedies are all part of a deity's plan, which has not been revealed to his believers. God needs these people in heaven. God has his reasons. Can't know the mind of God. But again, perhaps the least you could say is at minimum that this God allowed the event to happen. He, of course, could have prevented or stopped its occurrence by outright miracles, but obviously chose not to. And these tragedies in the above cases have happened equally to believers who are worshiping the deity and to believers who are not. So these tragedies confirm to non-believers what they have always acknowledged. And this is very important. Our world and our greater universe are provably, exquisitely indifferent to everything in it. Our world works precisely as expected if there were no deities or supernatural interventions to guide events. To any rational mind, based on these observations, it is arguably more likely that there is no personal God than that there is a personal God. I mean, if you have all these events happening that are undoubtedly evil, suffering, and there's a claim that there's a good, loving God out there, and there have been no miracles that have ever been shown to be factual, how does one make the case that it's more likely that there is a God? I mean, I'm pulling this back a little bit, not proof. I'm just saying more likely than not. And it's interesting that while miracles, which we'll define as supernatural interventions or happenings that defy natural laws, not just wondrous events like looking at the Milky Way, I'm talking something that should not happen based on physical law. These were common occurrences in biblical times, but in modern times, zero. And if the Black Plague, the Holocaust, and centuries of carnage in the Middle East didn't rise to the level of deserving a miracle, then just how high is that bar? Wouldn't these events that I cited at some level deserve just one of them a miracle, maybe? There are thousands of events that happen every day that deserve miracles and supernatural interventions, especially with prayer. Half the world, more than half the world, prays for a miracle. You're not praying for things that can commonly happen that wouldn't require prayer, but for miracles. We've not been able to find any. And this assessment is central to how secularists see our place in the universe. Because this is getting to what I'm talking about end-of-life issues. Because we have to understand how we position ourselves. What is our baseline understanding about what this is all about? It's not the hokey pokey. The sad and indisputable cold reality provides not only no convincing evidence for, but solid convincing evidence against a personal God whose attributes are supposed to be love, justice, being all-powerful and all-knowledgeable. And while non-believers always leave the door open for new evidence, we do, that could change our minds, none appears to be forthcoming. Yes, there have been a lot of awesome, remarkable, unexplainable, mysterious things. It seems like the religious people zero in on tumors that go away and these kind of medical things. I can't understand that. But none have been proven to be supernatural to that realm populated with the gods, angels, spirits, etc. And it's interesting and hopeful to note, however, that our worldview, slowly is being accepted, especially in the Western world. And the rate is increasing. Although harsh and until proven otherwise, is that all life is, as Darwin discovered, the products of unguided evolution by natural selection and by random acts and accidents of nature. Sorry, that's the best that we can say. And to religionists, this scientific evidence-based assessment is absolutely unpalatable. They will not accept this. You can talk till you're blue in the face. At its core, scraping away all the apologetics, the bottom line, in our opinion, is that believers simply believe because they wish it were otherwise. They look at the world, they see it acting just like I described. They cannot fathom that they're living in this kind of world. They have to believe something else, and they wrap their lives around that. They'll ask non-believers, how can you live in this world if you can't believe it's not governed by a loving God? And these type of questions go on. And I'm going to give you an answer to them. You can look at them and say, how do people who believe in and wrap their lives around non-existent entities, mythologies, and buying claims about the world that are provably false and reflect delusion of the first order, how do these people find not only meaning and purpose, but any credible worth to their lives? Turn it around. As back in the Bronx we'd say, was that a comeback or what? The secular and religious perspectives on end-of-life issues are influenced by respective beginning of life and how to live life issues. And these two latter positions lay the necessary foundation for what I'm about to talk about. I'm not going to dwell too much on the religious perspective. We kind of know it. Life is a sacred gift from a deity. Meaning, purpose, and worth are defined by the deity. There's heaven and hell. The goal of the world is to get into heaven. There's a rule book, an instruction manual, how to do it, the Bible, the Quran, that makes it clear how to get there. If the rules are not followed, you go to hell. But, secularists, we have this feeling that ultimately it's fear, it's guilt that motivate people for the religious life. And it's fear, a lot having to do with death. What happens afterwards? There's a conservative commentator who drives me a little crazy for other reasons, but one of the reasons that drives me crazy, her name is Laura Ingraham. And if you watch her on TV, she always chooses to wear her crucifix outside of her blouse. She could put it inside, but she never does. She leaves it outside. She wants to be identified as being a very religious person. She said, this, meaning this earth, is not our place. Our place, we believe, is with our Lord in heaven, not here. Many politicians feel the same way. It gets you very uneasy about how they're going to deal with problems when this is just more of a transition, for them. And I think this captures the religionist viewpoint that earthly life is less important and only a stepping stone to an eternity in heaven. The secular perspective. There is no I don't mean to be repetitious, but I need to hammer this in. There is no credible evidence for personal God, the supernatural realm, or an existence after this one. It's just that simple. Death means, now, this is so tough to say. Death means we disappear, we vanish, oblivion, forever. It is what it is. Psychologists tell us that this latter proposition is very difficult for humans to grasp. While we have no problem understanding that we did not exist until our conception, it strains our comprehension, especially having experienced the consciousness of life, that at some point in the future, unknown to us, I guess except for people who are on death row, we will suddenly, and as far as we know for an eternity, cease to exist. Somehow this second go-around of non-existence, that's all of us will endure, so to speak, seems strangely different in character from the non-existence that preceded our lives. At least with the first one, we ended up with existence. Now that we're in existence, this time, and let's frame it this way, there is at minimum an absence of credible evidence that there's an existence after this one. But let's also remember astronomer Carl Sagan's caveat that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But then let's remember the late and sorely missed Christopher Hitchens, who said that evidence that should be there, and when it's not, yes, evidence of that, absence of that evidence is indeed evidence of absence. And it is precisely because of the desire to continue to exist, to exchange the fear of death into hope for a blissful existence in heaven, that secularists believe humans turn to religion. Believers view life and how to live it as a top-down construct. God created everything 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, with all living things more or less in their present form. We look at it a little different. To non-believers, we view life and how to live it as a bottom-up construct. And we go back much farther than 6,000 to 10,000 years. Let me tell you the extent of the delusion among creationists. Let's see if I can. Imagine someone said to you, how far away is Campbell and Broadway? A secularist would say, about a mile. I think we'd agree. Campbell and Broadway is about a mile. A creationist answer to the question is, it's about 138,000 miles away. That's a distance more than halfway to the moon. This is the difference between the creationist view of when we came to be and the scientific one. A mile, 138,000 miles away. It's a tremendous difference in scope. This is just maybe the little review for someone, but it puts things in perspective because I think a perspective is important. Science states that before 13.8 billion years ago, there was no time, no space, no nothing. At least for our universe. It could be multiple universes, but for our universe, that's what it was. And just as our non-existence before and after our death is difficult to comprehend, the fact that nothing existed, no time, no space, is equally difficult to comprehend. In rough estimates, our Earth formed 4.5 billion years ago, and life began. By the way, how? Evolution is not designed to tell us. You know, one of the criticisms from believers is, people who believe in evolution, you can't explain how life came. Yeah, that's right, because evolution has nothing to do with what started life. Evolutionary theory deals with once life started, now we can talk about it. How life began, there are very interesting theories about that. We're starting to learn that certain organic chemicals just put together seem to be able to replicate themselves, and it goes from there, but we're not sure about that. It's the same way that science says that they know about the Big Bang, but only nanoseconds after it happened. They're accused of, well, you know how the universe began. No, they don't. They don't claim to. Cosmology starts with information, and the only information we have, we can draw it back to right after the Big Bang. But before that, how it began, why it began, science is silent on that. And all living things, plant, animal, fungi, you and me, the 10 to 14 million current, and the millions of species that went extinct can trace their origins to the earliest life forms from that distant past on the Earth. Homo sapiens came on the scene 480 million years later, about 200,000 years ago. And our immediate ancestors, who numbered only 2,000, started their journey out of southern Africa 70,000 years ago. And we can trace our DNA to those people, everybody in the world, to those 2,000 people. Yes, we are all cousins. And it's awesome that we can do that, but we're able to. The atoms in our body were created even earlier than that. The atoms of all of us sitting here were in stars, not our sun, but other stars that exploded in supernova billions of years ago. That's where our atoms are from. We have a true connection to the beginning of the universe. And consider all the begatting of your great-great-grandparents going back to the beginning of life on Earth. I mean, if those people didn't begat exactly like they did, you wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here. Or maybe we would, I don't know. But you are an unbroken chain of DNA going back to the beginning of time. The beginning of life, I should say, on Earth. But there's a philosophical axiom that will keep us all sane. It's one that it says that we cannot predict the probability of an event after it has already happened. And that's why you and I exist at the present time, why you and I exist in the present time in our present form. In this part of the world, or more profoundly, that we exist at all, is an incredible mystery. The odds against it happening are astronomical. Think of it. But here we are, and who says science is not fascinating? Therefore, secular thinking on end-of-life issues is based on nature being exquisitely indifferent to all that exists. In other words, shit happens. Meaning, purpose in our lives not coming from a deity, but from our culture and biology. Not living our lives to glorify or please a deity, not behaving well to assure eternity in heaven rather than in hell, but rather behaving well because it's the right thing and it's the moral thing to do. And we don't appreciate this life by thinking it's less important or merely a transition to a better one. So how do secularists make sense of it all? Well, we ask the same questions that religionists do. What's the meaning and purpose in life? What's it all about? Who are we? What are we here for? What's the origin of life? What's the nature of life? What's the nature of reality? For example, how do Christians contemplate end-of-life medical issues? Well, to believers, morbidity, which is disease and debility, and mortality, that's being susceptible to death, are not at their core medical or philosophical problems to be solved, but spiritual ones to be faced. Ecclesiastes said that there's a time to live and a time to die, and Christians are directed to make decisions that are not only wise medically, but are also in accordance with the will of God. The sanctity of life is always in the forefront of Christians' minds, and decisions should be thus formulated around biblical knowledge, a respect for human life, prayer, and the denial of self-interest or emotional desires. For faithful Christians, dying is a time to rejoice. There's a heavenly homecoming about to happen. But as our loved ones get closer to that heavenly goal, they must make sure that their decisions do not become the actual cause of their death. For example, Terry Schiavo. Christians understand that there's real danger that those who have been diagnosed as being in a vegetative state will in fact be viewed as vegetables and therefore subhuman. To Christians, these patients are still very much alive. Living means life. Biblical teaching regarding the nature of man acknowledges that he is composed of two distinct parts, the physical and the spiritual. If the body's alive, it must be the case that the spirit is present. Death should be declared only after and not before the fact. Christians recognize that the deliberate denial of food or water to innocent human beings, which is what sometimes happens, is homicide, for it's killing by starvation and dehydration. So let's contrast the guidelines that secularists use to contemplate end-of-life medical issues. We want to determine for ourselves how those issues are to be handled. What are the medical issues that we face mostly? Well, we can face instant death. That's trauma, heart attacks, and strokes. We can face compressed morbidity, like some cancers and heart disease that don't kill us right away, but it's a slow course, but it'll end in a few weeks and a few months. And then there's, of course, extended morbidity, and I'm going to talk about this. These are cancers and mental diseases, like Alzheimer's and multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's and ALS, that do kill us, but it's a long, drawn-out process, months to years. And secularists and religionists both want the good death, a death with dignity. But in reality, it's not the death that's good, or the death that has dignity, but it's that of dying. Let's call it good dying or dying with dignity. And Dr. Newland, in his book, How We Die, one of my references, said this: death with dignity as our society's expression of the universal yearning to achieve a graceful triumph over the stark and repugnant finality of life's last sputterings. And he goes on to say that death, not death, but disease, is the real enemy, the malign force that requires confrontation. I love this picture here. Let's get a little philosophical. How do believers and non-believers view aging? Well, the religious look at it, scripturally, like Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season and a time and purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die. To the non-religious, we look to other sources. Going way back, Homer, author of the Iliad, said, "Race of men is like the race of leaves. As one generation flourishes, another decays." Thomas Jefferson, the farmer and someone of questionable religious belief, wrote to a dying John Adams, "There is a ripeness of time for death regarding others as well as ourselves. When it is reasonable, we should drop off and make room for another growth. When we have lived our generation out, we should not wish to encroach on another." So if it is the way of nature that we not encroach on another, then nature must of necessity provide some means of certainty that we, like Homer's leaves, progressively attain a stage at which we drop off and make room for another growth, as Jefferson, the gentleman farmer, put it. Now, a little perspective would be instructive here. And by the way, anthropologists and people who get into longevity issues, they're much more comfortable with talking about how long people did live as opposed to how long people could have lived if they had proper health care, nutrition, and all those other things. So, average longevity began to significantly increase past the age of 30 only about 30,000 years ago, quite late in the spectrum of human evolution. Longevity to 1500, 20 to 35 years. From 1500 to 1800, only 30 to 40 years. From 1800 to today, it doubled in only 10 generations. Just think of it, as it says here, before 1800, the concept of having grandparents and grandchildren was a novel one. You didn't live long enough to have a grandfather or a grandchild. And only 115 years ago, the life expectancy was 49 years. And in 1921, countries like Canada had an infant mortality rate of about 10%, 1 in 10. The biggest desire for secularists, among the variety of desires related to end-of-life issues, is control. Because for secularists, it matters how we and when we die. The secular position is that if individuals should decide for themselves how they want to be cared for and when dying and when it is time to die, they do not want to follow any religiously based guidelines. Secularists, aside from hospice, which is accepted by both religious and the non-religious people, the choice of physician-assisted suicide, I'll call it PAS, and perhaps the option they want is to be euthanized. While passive euthanasia, which is removing life support, discontinuing feeding tubes, and in more cases than you might imagine, dosing a little higher dose of morphine in hospices and in the ICUs, it goes on, trust me, to significantly depress respiration for people who are moribund, is done. It's done all the time. In an op-ed last November, I suggested consideration to euthanasia, initiated by an advance directive written while the individual is compos mentis, or of sound mind, for when that individual is unable to help himself die as required by physician-assisted suicide. In late October of last year, I, like many others, was saddened by the death of this young lady, Brittany Maynard, who had a fast-progressing, painful, debilitating, and inoperable brain tumor. She decided to end her life in Oregon based on their allowing for PAS. By the way, the word suicide, physician-assisted suicide, it's kind of a pejorative term, and I feel a little uncomfortable using it because it's been criticized a lot, but we haven't really gotten a real better term, so bear with me as I use it, but begrudgingly. Her decision reopened the discussion about death with dignity. And my guest opinion in the Star on behalf of Freethought Arizona highlighted a more likely scenario for us, for most of us, than for what she experienced. And our argument encompassed several points that capture the secular thinking on this entire subject. And because it was what initiated this talk today, bear with me as I read it. For those who read it, it'll jog some memory. For those who didn't, it captures a lot of the issues that I want to bring out today. Free Thought Arizona started. Suppose you lost your mind. I mean, suppose you really lost your mind, irreversibly with no hope for treatment or cure. Would you want to go on living? Think of it. If you couldn't ever again coherently communicate with yourself and others, take care of bowel and bladder needs, remember to eat, chew, and then swallow your food, have any understanding of recent experiences or awareness of current surroundings, and were incapable of the most basic human functions, what rational reason could you justify to stay alive? Most of us, unfortunately, know people who have been or who are in such a state. And it's with sadness, it's heartbreaking and frustrating that we've watched these individuals whom we knew and perhaps loved, and who knew and perhaps loved us, who were once engaged with themselves in the outside world, progressively lose mental function and endure a relentless downhill course lasting months to years. Dementia is a chronic disease of aging, characterized by progressive cognitive decline that interferes with independent functioning. Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia, 75%, and with other brain diseases and trauma making up the rest. It is estimated that as many as 6.8 million people in the United States have dementia, and at least 1.8 of those are severely affected. This mental disorder increases steadily after the age of 65 and escalates after 85. It's the fastest growing age group in our country, the over 85. And this bolus of baby boomers, which many of us are part of, is just going to accelerate that rate. Studies in some communities have found that almost half of all people aged 85 and older have some form of dementia. Remember, human beings, all life, were meant to just live, reproduce, and then die. We are an outlier. We're living way longer than evolution intended us to. And we're seeing some of the effects. Severe dementia is untreatable. The United States spends $159 billion to $215 billion annually on dementia care, making it more costly than either heart disease or cancer. The money provides for institutional and home-based long-term care rather than medical services, which most of these patients additionally need. The burgeoning baby boom population, which is entering the age category where dementia strikes most, will double the costs by the year 2040. Something sensible needs to be done. Free Thought Arizona proposes a solution worthy of discussion and debate. We recommend an advanced medical directive giving individuals the option to request euthanasia if they were to suffer from severe dementia. Obviously, this treatment would need to be legalized. Euthanasia, to be clear, is different from physician-assisted suicide, which is allowed in 5 states: Oregon, Washington, Montana, New Mexico, and Vermont. But with physician-assisted suicide, people must be of sound mind when they ask for this assistance to die, and must also be able to self-administer the lethal medication. 2 steps, obviously, people with advanced mental disease cannot do. However, euthanasia carries the stigma of being used, what? Only on animals and first-degree murderers. This is unfortunate because it should also be viewed as a way to help people at their own request and on their own terms die with dignity. Determining the time for one's own death, a personal decision, asking to be euthanized for severe dementia, is rational and moral if the decision is made by a competent person in an advance directive which states, in no uncertain terms, that when certain mental functions cease, it is time to die. Death by euthanasia prevents needless suffering and indignity. It releases loved ones from the watching helplessly as futile and often prolonged palliative care is rendered to those who would otherwise refuse it. And it benefits society by redirecting limited health care dollars for treatments that will truly help others. Free Thought Arizona understands this issue is inherently controversial, stressful, and highly emotional. But by advocating for personal control over when and how one dies, whether with palliative care, physician-assisted suicide, or euthanasia, we are putting the individual, and not anyone else, in control of what should be a fundamental and private decision. So what are the factors in society that work against us choosing how we're going to die? Well, there's the healthcare system, there's the government, and then there's us. The healthcare system primarily with doctors, and yes, pharmaceuticals and hospitals. But in generations before ours, doctors were far more willing to recognize that the signs of defeat of being able to save a life, and were far less arrogant about denying them. How often do we hear, there's nothing more we can do? Said much more in the past than now. Modern doctors live with an amazing technology in pharmaceuticals. They want to exhaust all treatments to keep their patients alive. And the goal is misguided. Doctors are taught primarily how to save lives, not to end them. And many doctors today throw up the white flag of surrender way too late in the process. And just because medical science can sustain life, it doesn't mean it has to. The aphorism goes, it's a little cruel, but just because you're a fish doesn't mean you need to go for the bait. Our government laws and policies about end-of-life matters too often reflect religious belief. Perhaps this is because a significant percentage of our politicians are Christian and aware that over 80% of their constituency is too. That's why it was just said that, from a speaker before, I'm forgetting his first name, I'm sorry, but he said in his lifetime he's never going to see this change in Arizona, and nor in my lifetime too. God, these politicians bellow, not us, should decide how and when we die. And it seems to me like a little privileging of religion among politicians, and certainly an intrusion of church into state. Now, physician-assisted suicide, to be fair, is a 50-50 proposition in our country. 50% want it, 50% don't. It is one of those subjects that's difficult to debate when the language used by the religionists is, as I wrote in a recent op-ed related to Ted Cruz's use of religious references, frankly unintelligible to secularists. For example, if you base your arguments against physician-assisted suicide using the words like sacrament, sanctity of life, soul, spirit, spirituality, God, sin, prayer, these are conversation stoppers. We have no idea what the hell you're talking about. These words are irrelevant to us because they represent things that we have no conception of, and at their core, neither do these people who are saying them. But you know, if you wanted to argue against physician-assisted suicide, you don't need all these religious terms. I'll give you an example, and this is from Ron Lindsay in his book, The Necessity of Secularism, which I highly recommend. He is excellent. He says, you could argue against physician-assisted suicide by saying, look, the quality of palliative care would decline. Various vulnerable segments of our population, such as women, the poor, and minorities, would be adversely affected in disproportionate numbers by the availability of legal PAS. PAS will not be regulated properly, and there will be numerous abuses, such as patients being coerced to hasten their deaths. PAS will put us on a slippery slope to PAS on demand, non-voluntary euthanasia, and other dreaded outcomes. Now, while he doesn't agree with those arguments, he says at least religious people, those are things we can understand. We can debate those. And ourselves. How do we work against ourselves? Well, as we grow older, we increase our understanding and acceptance that our lives are finite and always subject to ending unexpectedly. This is the realization that lays the seed for the awful anxieties that we constantly live with. But as many great thinkers have reminded us, the greatest dignity to be found in death and dying is the life that preceded it. But dignity in dying, a good dying, an easy dying, it's not possible for a lot of people because of these things we talked about. I would like the expression to be changed a little bit from dignity in death or dying to, how about wording it, a very good life to the very end. Sometimes in hospice they say, every day we want to give you the best possible day you could ever have. I like that. You know, at death, it really doesn't matter anymore, does it? And this is something to think about as you drive home and you're stopped at the stoplight waiting for it to change. You'll never know you're dead. Ponder that. Okay, this last part I've been looking forward to. This is interesting, if I do say so myself. It's the fallacy of the heaven argument. Good, I got time to do it. And I want to thank, or give a shout out to writers Greta Christina and Adam Lee. Greta Christina especially publishes articles in Free Inquiry. And Adam Lee, whose work I read, and I've kind of condensed it. I wish this was original, but it's not. It's their thinking on it, and it's beautiful. It's so tight. So, in honor of them, evangelists will often approach their prey with the question, do you know where you're going after you die? I'm sure we've all heard that, especially. And they don't particularly appreciate the secularists' snarky but logical answer, which is a cemetery, a crematorium. It's undeniable that the prime motivating factor for people worldwide to believe in and worship God and follow his rules and regs and his 10 commandments and ask for forgiveness is to be assured of getting into heaven. And this assurance is person to person. In other words, family and friends and everybody else, you're on your own. Getting into heaven is a very personal thing. You can't get someone else into heaven. They have to do it themselves. And those who don't follow this well-lit, well-worn, and assured pathway to salvation will, as they're in no uncertain terms, they're going to go to hell. To continue to exist in a glorious place with fellow wonderful human beings forever is truly the best news anyone could receive. But consider the likes of Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Jeffrey Dahmer. If they had deathbed conversions, they would be in heaven. Seems a little unfair, but that's the way it's written. And that is why religion has always trumped secularism about who gets the better deal. I mean, to the question, what happens after death? We have not had a good answer to that. Why? Because it's not that we don't know. We have no evidence to show that there is anything after there. These other people talk about that they do know. And it's a shame that secularists have let religionists have their way on this argument. And that's one of the reasons why I'm presenting this today. And it's a shame because with a little rational thinking and probing and examination, it's evident that the concept of heaven is nonsense. Its major flaw is that it is incoherent, logically inconsistent, and contradictory. And even if it were true, it is no place any thinking person would want to be for reasons I'm going to show you in a second, especially for an eternity. And if the fallacy of heaven were more widely known, it would be a compelling reason for believers to revisit their beliefs in general and then give more attention to non-believers' attitudes on end-of-life issues. All right, here you go. The logical impossibility of heaven. And let me preface it by saying, although the Christian Bible has many verses describing the horrors and torments of hell, it has surprisingly little to say about what heaven is like. And maybe this is because, everyone knows intuitively that heaven is a great place, so publicity and advertising, you're wasting your money. But here's something we need to stipulate based on Christian doctrine, and I would assume Islamic doctrine too, that eternal life in heaven means an eternal continuation of some aspects of mortal life. The souls in heaven will retain the same memories, the same personality, the same character traits as they had on earth. The vision of 72 virgins just popped into my mind. Of course it's a continuation of... And if this is true, then here are some legitimate questions for those who believe in heaven. And you can ask your religious friends this. Follow me carefully. You will win this argument. Do those in heaven also retain their same sinful human nature? Are sins committed in heaven just as there are on earth? Is there anger or frustration in heaven? What about envy, pride, lust, greed, loneliness, hatred? Could there be harassment there? Infidelity, treachery, war? If all these things do exist in heaven, then why would anyone want to go there? If these emotions and actions don't exist in heaven, then how can that be reconciled with the fact that heaven is populated by otherwise fallible and sinful humans? So the two possibilities: either there is sin in heaven or there isn't. If there is sin in heaven, when my wife wants me to concentrate on what she's saying, she goes, Gil. So I'm going to you. If there is sin in heaven, why should heaven be that much better than earth? Let's remember that sin is a product of man's free will, and free will is a gift from God that makes humans special. So the key question, and here we go, does God revoke this gift of free will to heaven's inhabitants so there is no sin or evil? Those who affirm heaven as is a desirable goal must also affirm that free will is a bad thing, right? Because it leads to sin. Or at least that the lack of free will is a desirable thing. But that violates the key teaching of theism embodied in the free will defense, which states that God gave us free will because he wants us to choose him of our own accord and not have our love for him and others programmed into us like machines. Do you see this big ditch that's being dug right now by God? Does God desire for those in heaven to now lose that free will and become mindless automatons to him? It doesn't make any sense. It is not compatible with the high value God supposedly places on free will. So high, in fact, that he allows most of humanity to damn itself just so the fraction of people who worship him as he directs can be said to genuinely love him. If it is that important to God that we freely choose him, then how can he be content to be surrounded for all eternity by non-free will humanoids chanting his praises endlessly like broken records? Would this not represent the undoing of everything he sought to achieve by creating free will in the first place, especially on earth? Is it called a conundrum? Indeed, if he is content with this setup, then the creation of this mortal world was entirely unnecessary. Why not just throw out free will entirely and begin with heaven and not have to create a hell at all? Many people would say that a paradise without free will is no reward at all. Humans value autonomy and self-direction. Why would we want to give that up? If heaven is not a place where you get the reward you desire, it's not heaven. So is the solution then that there is a heaven and that there is free will but no sin? While this is the most interesting solution, it is the most potentially dangerous for theism. On its face, it may seem like the best solution for both God and human beings. But how can there be free will and no sin? Now, perhaps in heaven there's some different kind of form of free will, superior to the kind we have on earth. Perhaps the people there are gifted with perfect knowledge and perfect empathy, something of that sort, or perhaps people are transformed by being in the presence of God, and perhaps people receive new bodies and are immune from temptations. Christians call this, by the way, glorification. So that people in heaven are either no longer able to commit sins or are able to avoid doing so, yet retain their free will in other things. But of course, this begs the question, why didn't God create us with this kind of free will in the first place, and thus not have to create heaven or hell? See, it gets right back to that problem. But again, it is possible for God to create is it possible for God to create free-willed beings without the possibility of evil and sin? The only coherent answer to this is that God deliberately chose to create free-willed beings who would commit evil acts, even though he had the option of doing otherwise. Therefore, God wanted evil to exist, and an entity that wants evil to exist is itself evil and can't be good. Back in the Bronx, we'd say, huh? You get it? Secularists will often make the point, for argument's sake, that even if we concede that a personal God does exist, who would want to worship a being who allows evil and suffering to go on the way it does on earth? The same argument can be made that even if we concede that heaven does exist, or even concede that at least it is a comforting lie, who would want to live there? Follow me carefully on this. Think about going to heaven and completely losing your individuality. Think about the idea of a perfect, blissful afterlife where you and everyone you love will live forever. But also think about the fact that you will also be in heaven, no doubt, with people you dislike and hate, right? Will all your conflicts with them, petty and large, just disappear? If they don't, how will heaven be perfectly blissful? And if they do disappear, how will you be you? Conflicts arise because people are individuals with real differences between us. In heaven, either those conflicts will still be raging, or our differences, the individuality that makes us who we are, will be completely eradicated. Think about the loss of compassion. In heaven, you will be aware that other loved ones, or anyone for that matter, who didn't make it, are screaming and begging for mercy in the eternal agony of hell. If you're aware of this torture down there, is there any way for heaven to be blissful for you? And if you're not, if you're so blissed out by God's presence that your awareness of hell is obliterated, kind of like morphine, obliterating your awareness of pain, how could you be you? Isn't our love and compassion for others one of our best and most central parts of who we are? How could we possibly be who we are and not care about the suffering of people we love? And this is not abstract philosophizing. The question of how heaven will be heaven if our loved ones are burning in hell, it's a question on earth Christians struggle with terribly. Think of the grandparents who are tormented because their children and grandchildren have left the church and they knew that they were going to burn. It creates deep strife in families and causes many people great unhappiness. Just transfer that upstairs. And then, of course, the monotony and the boredom of heaven. People need to change. We need to be challenged. We need to grow. We need to learn to be happy. Wouldn't an eternity of any one thing eventually become tedious and drive you mad? For you golfers, every shot that you make is perfect. For you gardeners, every garden you plant has there's no challenge to it anymore. It would seem that our personalities would have to change so much that we would become to others and ourselves unrecognizable. And by the way, as for these near-death experiences that are making the headlines and the popular books, it's just that. It's near death. It's not death. We know that the brain deprived of oxygen causes hallucinations. We know that. And we also know that no one has been brought back from really being dead. So however this little kid explains it and everybody else with the white light, it's BS at some level. Secularists who understand that a belief which makes our experience more pleasant but is incapable of being true and therefore unworthy of acceptance are, in my view, not only brutally honest but very brave. So we're a very brave group, our camp here, because we're really facing the world the way it's laid out for us. We're not confabulating. We're not saying we know stuff that we have no possibility of knowing. And isn't it the duty of every person to rationally and skeptically examine such a proposition as heaven before accepting it? And if that proposition turns out not to be supported by logic or evidence, isn't it the mark of a mature mind to set aside and face life as it really is? You should be proud of yourself, those secularists in the group. Comforting, though the idea of heaven may be, a rational examination shows that it suffers from intractable logical problems that I just described and others that I've omitted. Therefore, we should face up to the fact that it is a fiction and find within ourselves the wisdom and honesty to go on without it. So in summation, these are the secular attitudes towards death. Secular understandings of death can withstand criticism and scrutiny. The idea that we didn't exist for billions of years before we were born and that it wasn't painful or bad. And the big question is, will death be the same? The idea that, and this is just a little summarizing so you leave with a tune to whistle here, our genes and our ideas will live on after we die, that each of us was astronomically lucky to have been born at all, that death is a deadline, something that helps us focus our lives and treasure the experiences that we have, that loss, including death, is necessary for life and change to be possible, that things don't have to be permanent to be meaningful, that your life, your slice of the timeline, will always have been there even though you die, and that death is a natural physical process that connects us intimately with nature and the universe. And these secular philosophies of death and others can withstand scrutiny because they're based in reality. And for many atheists, like many of us, this is profound comfort. Spiritual believers, on the other hand, thinking about death are propelled into cognitive dissonance. That's holding two ideas, and there's tension between those two ideas because they don't make sense, but accepting them as real. Like, oh, my mom's not really dead, my friend's not really dead, I'm not really going to die. Spiritual beliefs don't make any sense because they aren't supported by any evidence. They're mostly founded on wishful thinking. People make them up as they go along, and people are comforted by them as long as they don't really think about them or examine them. And from the non-believer vantage point, that's not a happy way to live. Believers don't make an honest effort. I was talking to Jane this morning about this. Believers don't make an honest effort to try to falsify their beliefs, as do non-believers. Ask a believer, what effort have you put into falsifying or trying to find out what's wrong with your religious belief? It'll be a fascinating, they'll look at you and they'll be agaped. That question has never been posed to them. But to secularists, sure, we question things all the time. Scientists, the first time they make a discovery, the first thing they do is they try to prove they're wrong. Because they know that all their friends are going to try to prove them wrong, might as well get out ahead of it. That's a very honest way of going at something. I believe something, but let me see if there's something wrong with that. A secular foundation for dealing with death, I would argue, is more consoling than a religious one. One doesn't constantly juggle a flock of inconsistent, incoherent ideas or put them on the back burner. When you grieve a death of a loved one, you can actually experience the true grief, and when you contemplate your own eventual death, you can actually experience true fright. Accept it. In my family, we just had a dear cousin in Holland killed in an auto accident this past week. We even got the picture of it because it made the news. It was horrible. But I didn't have any illusion that, God took her for a certain reason. It was a mistake. It was a wet road in a small town in Holland. A semi was coming around the bend, lost traction, right into her. It's because of this understanding of death is based on reality that it can withstand as much exploration and contemplation as you care to give it. So you can delve into it as much as you like. Dealing with death as an atheist seems to be at first harsh, but I think it's easier. But let's remember that while secular philosophies of death may be comforting and appealing to some, they are probably not to others. But it's absurd to say that religious ideas about death are inherently more appealing than secular ones. For a lot of us, they aren't. And for a lot of us, the exact opposite is true. So let's stop treating the subject of death as if it only belongs to religion. And I'm going to finish up, and you've been very patient, and I really appreciate it. We all want the opportunity to have a last word with a dear one, and most of the time it's to express love or other deep sentiments. Sometimes, however, it's for other important things. For example, my parents rarely, if ever, said to the 4 children of which I'm the oldest, that I or we love you. This was perhaps because it was so obvious to me and my siblings that they did love us, that for them to express it, it's like, what's wrong, So I'll end my talk with my mother's last words. And I think it highlights the variety of things on even some religious people's minds. And my mother was a very religious woman, as is my father, who's still living. And this talk, if he gets word of it, will probably shorten his life, but Pop, I got to do what I got to do. In 2008, my father won 2 tickets to a play at the music hall for a Sunday in February. I told him that if they were going to use the tickets, that I would chauffeur them to and from, because, if you know the way the music hall is, if I could just pull up on Church Avenue, let them out, it's a little bit of a walk to the music hall, but it's better than them finding a parking spot and all that, and I can go to my office and get some work done. So my mom and dad, 89 and 90 at the time, mentioned that they did want to go, but would let me know for sure during the week. If they weren't going to go, they would give away the tickets. It was kind of a big band thing. My father loves the big bands. By Friday of that week, I hadn't heard from my mom, so I called her and asked her if they were going. My mom, in her inimicable way, said, "Darling, of course we're going." The next morning, she awoke with severe chest pain. She firmly instructed my father, as only my mother could, what to do, and it was in this exact order. She said, his name is Nathan, she calls him Nady. "Nady, get me 4 aspirin, my hairpiece, my lipstick, and call 911. In that order. The paramedics stabilized her and rushed her to St. Joe's, where a stent was put into her heart. As you can imagine, the family kind of gathered that morning as the call went out. She was, of course, very, very heavily sedated and sent to the intensive care unit. The cardiologist informed us that her situation was very critical, and he didn't think she would recover because she had had these things before. My father, brother, and sister and I were at her bedside in the ICU. We assured her that we were there with her and that all that could be done would be done. And all hooked up to IV lines, monitors, and with 100% oxygen on her face. My mom, I was here, my father was here, my mom motioned to my father to come closer. And we all leaned in to what turned out to be her last words. Summoning up all her strength, she lifted the mask off her face, and in the same firm manner she spoke to her husband earlier that morning, she said to him, "Nady, be sure to give away the tickets for tomorrow." And then she died. Thank you.
Thank you, Gil, for a very good presentation. We have time for a few question and answers right now, so come up to the mic and we'll get you recorded. If you have anything profound to say, that would be great. We'd like it to be in the form of a question if possible, okay? Okay.
Hi, Gil. Thanks very much. There's one thing that's questioning me, and I have a perspective, and I want to give it to you and see maybe you can put it together. The aspect of dying and suicide you brought up. I think the suicide only comes in when the person is of sound mind, and they can make a decision, either pull the plug or let's have an assisted suicide. But if a lot of people are beyond that stage and they can't make that decision anymore. So to say, kill that person, it does seem wrong, but to just let the thing run out seems like the right thing
Sometimes
to do.
it takes a long time for that thing to run out.
Yeah.
But if the argument that Free Thought Arizona made in that guest opinion was that if in the years that you're compos mentis of sound mind, you leave a directive that says, if I ever get to this point, whatever it is that you feel like, if I ever get to that point, it's time that I die, that instruction to be euthanized, which is a very easy thing to do, would be followed.
Is it time to die, or is it time to just let the thing run out?
It's your choice.
Okay, okay.
It's a choice that can be made, yeah.
Okay.
Phil?
Thanks, Gil. Good talk. Just a quick question. Do you know of any nurses or doctors that want all the excessive ICU type of techniques employed on them to extend their lives?
Do I know them personally?
Do you know of anyone that wants that done to them? Because I work in the pre-hospital area and no one wants that done to them.
No, if you've ever had an experience in an ICU and all that, it's not a pleasant place. And with the technology that we have these days, you can keep someone going for quite a while. And if your brain is shot, unless you're going to be used for organ donation, it's really not something to do.
Thanks for a great talk, Gil. Since, as atheists, we know that, as you mentioned, we kind of already know what death is like because we can kind of reflect on what it was like before we were born. It's a return to a state of nothingness, basically. Doesn't it behoove us to become primary advocates for life extension research and extension of the healthy lifespan, rather than just accept our fourscore and 10 if we're lucky, to support Aubrey de Grey and Ray Kurzweil, and even though these are none of these efforts may benefit any of us in our lifetimes, but still, when you look at that slide on human progress, that this would be, it's like a moral obligation to continue that trend and increase the healthy lifespan,
Yeah, a couple of observations. One is that to extend life, you have to understand, I talked about that all animals, you come into existence, you age, you copulate to get the next generation, and then you die. That's just the format that life has. When we live into the 80s and 120, we're really pushing the envelope, and there may be an absolute fixed amount of time. For example, we haven't had anyone live longer, as far as we know, than Jean Calment. So there is a kind of an end. There is something at the end of our chromosomes called the telomere, and there's just so many cycles that can go through. So there is a brute end about which you can't go any further, and it's somewhere in the low or early 100s, because no one has ever lived more than that. Can we try to extend it and play with the genes and all that? I guess we can, Robert?
Gil, isn't it true that the life expectancy extensions have mostly come from the eradication of childhood diseases, and that 100 years ago, if you made it to 5, you had as good a chance to get into 70 as we do now? Yeah. It's just that you didn't die in childhood. Isn't that the case?
Absolutely. The childhood mortality in the 1800s was hovering 50% or more. It was not unusual to have a bunch of kids expecting that a couple of them would die. It's just standard stuff. My father had two sisters that died in a family, a number of 7. One was scarlet fever. You don't hear that anymore. Yes?
Not a question, but a suggestion. Embedded in most deaths is the funeral process. And my observation is that I think as part of your plans for dying is to include what you might like to have said in your funeral. I was at a Catholic mass funeral just 2 weeks ago, and the woman who died, her name was mentioned, I'd say at least 50 times, and not one personal comment about anything that happened in her life or anything she did was made. And actually even by the family. And at one point, the person from the family who was kind of in charge started to say, is there anything anybody here would like to say? And as she asked that question, she turned to the priest, and the priest said, you can take care of that during the reception. And it's just, I think when you're going to funerals, particularly religious ones, you might just notice that seems to be a part of everything, that the whole thing, if it's an opportunity to go on and on about religion and heaven and so forth, that's what the funeral will be.
Thank you. Good point.
One of the things, you mentioned the Alzheimer situation, and I'd like to recommend the movie Still Alice, because in there she recognized that when she would no longer be able to recognize her own kids or something, or she starts getting that feeling, she has pills put aside, and she reads this and goes to take those pills. So I think that's a very important thing. She was aware and knew what she wanted to do, and never was
Right.
able to achieve it,
Right, I heard
unfortunately.
it's a very good movie.
Yeah, okay.
Patty has a question.
When my late husband was dying, they advised me to write his obituary. That's one of the best pieces of advice I ever received.
Yes, that thought about doing that and actually writing what you would want in your obituary takes a lot of pressure off the family because it's what you want. What more could you ask for?
Another suggestion, when you go or are part of memorial services, make sure they get recorded. With all the video cameras now, you go and tell stories about the loved one that's gone, but the immediate family is still usually too much in shock to record or remember the stories, and a little videotape or a DVD would be so comforting in months and years to come.
So noted.
He reminds me of the celebration of life, which is usually done months later, and then all the grieving is done, and it's now we can talk clearly about the life that the person had and bring up some memorabilia and things of that nature. So I think that's an important thing too that we have. So just a minute, we have another person.
Okay, I think that I might probably be the last to say, so I want to be on the light side. Talking about death, it's time to... You mentioned timely death and premature death, I'm sorry, not death. And you never explained what is timely death and what is premature. Because you probably don't know the answer, but I do. And I'll tell you what it is. Actually, it came about to me when I talked to an insurance agent, and she said, should you die prematurely? And I said, what is prematurely? And she said, before your last life expectancy. And then I thought, well, when you are born, your life expectancy, I'll just make up numbers, okay, is maybe 40, because in the first year you may die, your chances to die are high. You survive 1 year, it becomes 60. You survive, you get to age 10, it is 65. You get to age, I'll jump, you get to age 50, it's now 72, etc. You get to age 90, it's probably 92. You get to age 100, it's 101. You get to age 107, it's 107 and 3 days, etc., etc. At any age, you still have a fraction of a second in front of you, so whenever you die, it's premature death.
Okay. On that note,
I'll amend my presentation for future reference there. Thank you.
on that
I'll
note,
amend
let's thank Gil again.
I'll change that to note that. Thank you.
Some of us go to lunch and then.